In the early morning light of October 1943, Lieutenant Junior Grade Masajiro Kawato of the Imperial Japanese Navy looked out across the wing of his Mitsubishi Type 0 fighter. He was flying over the emerald waters of Wake Island, confident in the absolute supremacy of his machine. For nearly 2 years, the lightweight fighter had carried Japanese aviators to unchallenged dominance across the Pacific. It was a masterpiece of aeronautical engineering designed with a single, uncompromising goal to outclimb and outturn anything the Allies could put into the air. To the veteran pilots of the Empire, the skies belonged to them, and any American attempt to challenge that ownership was met with a swift, burning descent into the ocean. The Americans had sent their best fighters, the boxy Grumman Wildcat and the clumsy Curtiss Warhawk, but none could match the agility of the Zero. Japanese pilots laughed at the heavy, slow-moving targets that seemed to crawl across the sky. This confidence was not born of arrogance, but of lived experience. From Pearl Harbor to the Solomons, the Zero had established a reputation for absolute invincibility, earning the right to be feared by every Allied pilot who dared to take off. In the quiet of his cockpit, Kawato scanned the horizon, expecting the familiar silhouette of the Wildcat. He had been trained in the grueling military schools of the Empire, surviving a selection process that accepted only the absolute elite. Like his fellow aviators, he believed that the warrior spirit of Japan, combined with the lightweight perfection of the Zero, would always overcome the industrial masses of the Western democracy. On this morning, however, the distant shapes approaching his formation did not look quite like Wildcats. They were wider, sitting lower in the sky, with massive radial engines that hummed with a deep, menacing growl. Kawato did not know it yet, but he was staring at the vanguard of an industrial avalanche that would systematically sweep his entire world from the sky. The new aircraft was the Grumman F6F Hellcat, a weapon engineered not to match the Zero in a duel, but to destroy it through the cold mathematics of modern warfare. To understand how this confrontation came to be, one must look back to the early months of 1942, when the Pacific was still a Japanese lake. In those dark days, American naval aviators faced a crisis of survival. Their standard fighter, the F4F Wildcat, was rugged and well-armed, but it was hopelessly outmatched by the Zero in speed, climb, and maneuverability. Lieutenant Commander John Thack, a brilliant tactician, had warned his superiors that a single Zero could easily dominate several Wildcats in a standard dogfight. The American pilots were forced to rely on defensive teamwork just to survive. Thack developed a revolutionary maneuver, a defensive weave where two Wildcats crossed paths repeatedly, baiting the agile Zero into the path of a wingman's guns. While the Thack weave saved countless lives, it was ultimately a shield, not a sword. The United States Navy knew that defensive tactics alone could not win a global war across the vast expanses of the Pacific. They needed a new fighter, one that did not merely survive the Zero, but actively hunted it down. They turned to the engineers at the Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation in Bethpage, Long Island. Leroy Grumman, the founder of the company, was a quiet, modest man who believed in building aircraft that would bring their pilots home safely. His factory had earned the nickname of the Grumman Iron Works. The Grumman philosophy was simple: build them strong, build them simple, and build them in numbers that the enemy could not possibly comprehend. In June 1942, as the smoke still cleared from the Battle of Midway, Grumman Vice President Jake Swerble traveled to Pearl Harbor to meet with the combat pilots who had survived encounters with the Zero. Swerble sat in dusty, ready rooms, listening to men like Jimmy Thack and Jim Flatley. The pilots did not ask for a delicate, agile aerobatic machine. They asked for more speed, more climb, and above all, more armor. They told Swerble that the Zero was a fragile masterpiece, but its speed and climb allowed it to dictate the terms of every engagement. To beat it, they needed a massive hammer, not a rapier. Swerble took these notes back to Bethpage, where chief designer Bill Schwendler was already working on the prototype of the F6F. The design was immediately overhauled to accommodate the pilot's demands. The original prototype had been designed around a 1,700 horsepower engine, but the engineers realized this would not be enough to carry the heavy armor and armament required to defeat the Zero. They decided to install the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp radial engine, a powerhouse capable of producing 2,000 horsepower. This was a monumental engineering decision. The engine was so large and heavy that the entire fuselage of the fighter had to be widened and strengthened to hold it. The resulting aircraft was massive. It had a wing area of 327 square feet, the largest of any single-engine fighter used by the United States during the war. To the untrained eye, the new fighter looked bloated and heavy. It lacked the sleek, graceful lines of the Zero, appearing more like a flying barrel than a high-performance interceptor. When Japanese intelligence officers first received reports of the new Grumman design, they dismissed it as an overweight failure, believing that the Americans had sacrificed maneuverability for unnecessary bulk. Their calculations were mathematically correct by pre-war standards. A heavy fighter would naturally turn slower, lose energy faster in a climb, and be an easy target for a skilled pilot in an agile machine. What the Japanese calculations failed to include, however, was the raw, brutal power of 2,000 horses pulling that massive airframe through the sky. The physical reality of the F6F was a testament to the industrial philosophy of a democratic nation. Grumman did not ask its pilots to be martyrs. It built them armor. Inside the cockpit, the pilot was protected by 212 pounds of hardened steel plate. A thick bullet-resistant windshield sat directly in front of his face, capable of stopping a Japanese 77mm round. The fuel tanks were not bare aluminum shells like those in the Zero. They were wrapped in thick layers of self-sealing rubber that would swell and close the moment a bullet passed through them. To feed the massive double wasp engine, the Hellcat carried 250 gallons of high-octane fuel inside its protected fuselage, allowing it to remain in the air for hours. For firepower, Schwendler installed 6 Browning 50 caliber machine guns in the folding wings. These weapons were renowned for their reliability and devastating rate of fire. When all 6 guns fired simultaneously, they sent over 70 rounds of armor-piercing and incendiary ammunition into the air every single second. In contrast, the Zero carried only 2 7.7mm machine guns and 2 slow-firing 20mm cannons with limited ammunition. While the Zero was designed to win a duel with a few precise shots, the Hellcat was built to saturate the sky with a wall of lead that no fabric-covered aircraft could survive. The heavy armament and armor meant the Hellcat weighed over 9,000 pounds empty, nearly twice the weight of the nimble Japanese fighter it was built to destroy. But the engineering team had another secret weapon in their design, a massive wing that could fold backward parallel to the fuselage, utilizing the innovative Grumman stowing system. This folding mechanism allowed aircraft carriers to pack twice as many fighters into their hangar decks, doubling the striking power of every American task force. As the final blueprints were approved, the United States Navy prepared to launch an industrial assault on a scale the world had never witnessed. But before the first production Hellcats could reach the fleet, a stroke of fortune in the frozen north would give American pilots the key to defeating the Zero. In June 1942, during the attack on the Aleutian Islands, a 19-year-old Japanese pilot named Tadayoshi Koga crash-landed his Mitsubishi Zero on the marshy ground of Akutan Island. Koga did not survive the landing, but his aircraft remained almost completely intact, flipped upside down in the soft mud of the remote island. 5 weeks later, an American patrol plane spotted the gleam of metal in the marsh. The salvage crew was quickly dispatched to recover the prize. The captured fighter, which became known as the Akutan Zero, was carefully disassembled, crated, and shipped to the Naval Air Station in San Diego, California. American engineers worked around the clock to repair the damaged fighter, replacing its broken propeller and straightening its bent fuselage. By September 1942, the repaired Zero was ready for flight testing under the command of Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders. Sanders flew the Zero in mock combat against every fighter in the American inventory, pushing the nimble Japanese machine to its absolute limits. The flight tests revealed the physical boundaries of the Zero's legendary performance. Sanders discovered that at speeds above 200 miles per hour, the control surfaces became stiff and difficult to move. The Zero's manual control cables stretched under high aerodynamic loads, making it almost impossible for a pilot to roll the aircraft to the right at high speeds. Furthermore, the Zero's float-type carburetor would cut fuel to the engine if the aircraft was pushed into a sudden vertical dive, causing the engine to sputter and lose power. These technical weaknesses were not flaws in the Zero's design. They were the necessary trade-offs of a fighter built entirely for lightweight agility at low speeds. Sanders compiled these findings into a detailed tactical guide, which was immediately distributed to every Navy and Marine fighter squadron in the Pacific. The instructions were clear. Never attempt to dogfight a Zero at low speeds. If a Zero gets behind you, roll to the right, dive at maximum power, and let the heavy weight of your aircraft pull you away. This intelligence arrived at the exact moment the first Grumman Hellcats were rolling off the assembly lines in Bethpage. The Grumman factory in New York was a temple of democratic industrialism, operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week under the glow of fluorescent lights. Thousands of citizens, many of whom had never touched a rivet gun before the war, stepped onto the assembly line to build the massive new fighter. Leroy Grumman implemented innovative programs to keep his workforce motivated and healthy, establishing a nursery for the children of working mothers and offering high wages. The morale on the factory floor was translated directly into steel and aluminum. The speed of production began to accelerate at a rate that defied all prior manufacturing standards. In 1942, the factory produced just 12 Hellcats. By 1943, that number exploded to over 2,500 fighters. At the peak of production, the Bethpage facility was turning out one completed F6F Hellcat every 60 minutes, a relentless rhythm that never faltered. This industrial cadence was an ocean away from the realities of the Japanese Empire, where factories struggled to source aluminum, high-grade steel, and aviation fuel. While Japanese craftsmen built Zeros with meticulous individual care, American factories stamped out Hellcats with the mechanical precision of an automobile assembly line. If your family has a story connected to the factories of the home front or the pilots who flew these machines, those personal accounts are an essential part of this history. Share them in the comments below. By the late summer of 1943, the first wave of Hellcats was loaded onto the decks of the new Essex-class fleet carriers, steaming toward the Pacific. The young American pilots who climbed into the cockpits of these new fighters were the product of a systematic, rigorous training pipeline that spared no expense. Before an American pilot saw combat, he had logged over 300 hours of flight time, mastering formation flying, gunnery, and carrier landings. In contrast, the veteran elite of the Imperial Japanese Navy was beginning to thin, their ranks depleted by the bloody battles of Guadalcanal and the Solomons. The Japanese High Command, operating on a philosophy of spiritual superiority, believed that their remaining pilots could overcome any technological deficit through sheer determination. They had no idea that they were about to send their best and bravest into a meat grinder designed by engineers and fueled by the unlimited resources of a continent. On August 31, 1943, the F6F Hellcat made its quiet combat debut during a carrier strike against Marcus Island. The initial encounters were brief, but they served as a proving ground for the tactics Eddie Sanders had developed using the captured Akutan Zero. American pilots quickly learned that the Hellcat was a remarkably stable gun platform, allowing them to fire devastating bursts from distance with high accuracy. The real test, however, would come when the new fighter clashed directly with the main force of the Japanese carrier groups over the Gilbert Islands. In November 1943, during the invasion of Tawa, Japanese Zero squadrons rose from their island airfields to intercept the American fleet. The Japanese pilots, still flying the lightweight Mitsubishi fighters they had used since Pearl Harbor, spotted the large, boxy shapes of the approaching Americans. Mistaking the new Hellcats for the older, slower Wildcats, the Japanese aces smiled through their oxygen masks, confident of another easy victory. They rolled into their dives, executing the elegant sweeping turns that had made them the masters of the Pacific sky for 2 long years. But as they closed the distance, they realized with a sudden, chilling shock that the rules of engagement had changed forever. This was the moment of first contact, where the earned confidence of the Empire met the overwhelming reality of the democratic arsenal. Instead of turning to evade the diving Zeros, the heavy American fighters simply accelerated, their massive engines roaring as they climbed straight up into the attack. The Japanese pilots tried to follow, but their lighter engines could not match the brute vertical thrust of the Double Wasp. Within seconds, the agile Zeros found themselves looking down the barrels of 6 heavy machine guns, their lightweight wooden and fabric wings about to face an industrial storm. This is the end of the first part of our account, where the pride of the Empire stands on the precipice of an unimaginable reckoning. The first major clash over Tarawa was a tactical shock that sent tremors through the entire structure of Japanese naval aviation. In the sun-settled afternoon, a small group of Hellcats from the carrier USS Independence shot down 30 Zeros, losing only one of their own aircraft in the process. The surviving Japanese pilots returned to their bases in a state of quiet disbelief, struggling to explain what they had witnessed in the sky. Lieutenant Masajiro Kawato, who survived the chaotic engagement, would later describe the terrifying speed and durability of the new American machine. He watched in horror as his 20mm cannon shells struck a Hellcat, only to see the massive fighter ignore the damage and continue its attack. The heavy armor plate and self-sealing fuel tanks of the Grumman design had turned the American fighter into a flying bunker, immune to the light weapons of the Zero. The realization that their primary weapon was no longer superior was a devastating psychological blow to the professional soldiers of the Empire. For 2 years, they had relied on the absolute maneuverability of their aircraft to protect them from harm, sacrificing their own safety for offensive agility. Now, they found themselves facing an enemy who could dictate the speed, altitude, and terms of every single encounter. The Japanese technical experts in Tokyo scrambled to find a solution, attempting to upgrade the Zero with heavier engines and self-sealing fuel tanks. But their efforts were hamstrung by the systemic weaknesses of their industrial economy, which lacked the raw materials and machine tools to scale production. The upgraded Zero, known as the Model 52, was heavier and slower than its predecessor, losing the very agility that had made it legendary. Meanwhile, the Grumman production lines in New York continued to accelerate, flooding the Pacific with improved variants of the Hellcat. By early 1944, the F6F-5 entered service, featuring a refined engine cowling, a redesigned windshield, and even greater armor protection. The technological gap between the two nations was no longer a crack. It had become an unbridgeable chasm that swallowed the remnants of Japan's elite. As the American fleet advanced toward the inner ring of the Japanese Empire, the stage was set for the ultimate test of the two systems. In June 1944, the United States Navy launched the invasion of the Mariana Islands, targeting Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. The capture of these islands would put the new Boeing B-29 Superfortress bombers within range of Tokyo, a mortal threat to the Japanese home islands. In response, Admiral Somu Toyoda ordered the entire remaining strength of the Imperial Japanese Navy to engage the American fleet in a decisive battle. Toyoda believed that a massive, coordinated airstrike from his 9 aircraft carriers could annihilate the American forces and turn the tide of the war. He assembled over 450 carrier-based aircraft, including the latest models of the Zero, the Judy dive bomber, and the Jill torpedo bomber. Many of the pilots assigned to the strike were young conscripts, rushed through training programs that had been cut from hundreds of hours to just 40. They were brave, patriotic, and completely unprepared for the mechanical precision of the defense they were about to encounter. Awaiting them was Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher's Task Force 58, a colossal armada featuring 15 fleet carriers carrying nearly 500 Hellcats. On the morning of June 19, 1944, the Japanese carriers launched their first massive wave of attackers, numbering over 100 aircraft. As the Japanese formations flew toward the American fleet, they were detected by the advanced radar systems of the United States battleships. The American fighter directors, sitting in darkened combat information centers, calmly plotted the incoming raid and began directing the defense. On the flight decks of Task Force 58, the engines of hundreds of F6F Hellcats roared to life, their propellers slicing through the warm Pacific air. The Hellcats climbed to 30,000 feet, positioning themselves high above the incoming Japanese formations, waiting for the signal to strike. When the order came, the sky became a vertical racetrack as the heavy American fighters dove on their unsuspecting prey at over 400 miles per hour. The young Japanese pilots, flying in tight formations, suddenly found themselves engulfed in a storm of 50 caliber fire from above and behind. The lightweight Zeros, lacking armor and self-sealing fuel tanks, erupted into violent sheets of flame at the first touch of the heavy machine gun rounds. It was not a dogfight, it was an industrial harvest. The sky was quickly filled with hundreds of long trails of black, oily smoke. The American pilots, utilizing their high-speed diving capability, would strike a target, zoom back up to altitude, and dive again on another victim. A single American pilot, Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell, shot down 7 Japanese aircraft in a single mission on that historic day. By afternoon, the radio waves were filled with the ecstatic reports of American pilots, leading one observer to remark that it was just like an old-fashioned turkey shoot. The engagement became immortalized in military history as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a day of unprecedented slaughter in the clouds. When the sun finally set over the Philippine Sea, the Imperial Japanese Navy had lost 346 aircraft in a single day of air combat. The United States Navy, by contrast, had lost just 30 Hellcats in aerial action, with most of their pilots successfully rescued from the water. The strategic consequences of the battle were immediate and absolute. The offensive capability of the Japanese carrier fleet was permanently destroyed. The statistics of the battle are preserved in the official collections of the Naval History and Heritage Command. If you have analyzed these records or studied the specific air groups involved, please share your sources in the comments below. For the survivors of the Japanese air groups, the disaster over the Marianas was not just a military defeat, it was the collapse of their entire worldview. The professional soldiers of the empire had believed that the superior spirit of their warriors would always overcome the material abundance of their enemies. But on that warm summer day, they discovered that spirit meant nothing when confronted with the cold, unyielding reality of industrial mathematics. The legendary ace Saburo Sakai, who was stationed on the island of Iwo Jima, witnessed the final, tragic stages of this technological transformation. Sakai, who had survived the bloody battles of 1942, was sent aloft with a group of young, inexperienced pilots to intercept an approaching American raid. He would later write that he looked back at his wingmen and saw only terrified children, boys who had been given only a few weeks of training before being sent to face the elite of the world. When the formation was bounced by 15 Hellcats, Sakai used his legendary skills to evade every attack for over 20 minutes, returning to his base untouched. But his wingmen, who lacked the experience to counter the high-speed tactics of the Americans, were systematically shot down within the first minutes of the encounter. Sakai realized with a quiet, devastating sorrow that the war was lost, not because of a lack of courage, but because the system they served had abandoned them. The Japanese leadership, having failed to build an industrial infrastructure capable of sustaining a modern war, had chosen to treat their young men as expendable resources. The tragic culmination of this philosophy emerged in the final months of the war, when the Japanese high command turned to the desperate tactic of the kamikaze. The Zero, once the proud symbol of Imperial Japanese technological achievement, was stripped of its landing gear and loaded with explosives, turned into a manned missile. The young men who climbed into these flying coffins were taught only how to take off and crash, their lives sacrificed to delay an inevitable defeat. Even in this desperate role, they found their path blocked by the relentless wall of F6F Hellcats circling the American fleet. The radar-equipped Hellcat night fighters, guided by the combat information centers of the carriers, hunted down the suicide planes long before they could reach their targets. The defense was absolute, a mechanical system that operated with the cold efficiency of the factories that had produced it. To look at the final statistics of the air war in the Pacific is to understand the true meaning of the arsenal of democracy. Between 1943 and 1945, the Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation built 12,275 F6F Hellcats. In those same 30 months, the entire Japanese aircraft industry, starved of resources and shattered by bombing, struggled to produce fewer than 6,000 Zeros of all models. The Hellcat was credited with the destruction of 5,223 enemy aircraft in aerial combat, establishing an unprecedented 19-to-1 kill ratio. But the most telling statistic of the entire war lies in the fate of the pilots who flew these opposing machines. Of the thousands of Hellcats built, only 270 were lost in aerial combat, a testament to the heavy armor and self-sealing fuel tanks designed by Bill Schwendler. The Grumman Ironworks had fulfilled its quiet promise to the parents of America, building a machine that would bring their sons home from the war. For the Japanese survivors, the post-war era brought a profound, silent reflection on the system that had led them to the brink of annihilation. Many of the surviving pilots, including Saburo Sakai, dedicated their remaining years to advocating for peace and reconciliation between the two former enemies. Sakai traveled to the United States on multiple occasions, meeting with the very naval aviators he had fought in the skies over the Pacific. In those quiet meeting rooms, there was no jingoism, no boasting, and no celebration of death. Only the shared understanding of men who had survived a terrible storm. They looked at each other not as former enemies, but as fellow aviators who had been caught in the machinery of global conflict. The real greatness of the American achievement was not the sheer tonnage of aluminum or the high body counts, but the generosity and humanity shown to those it defeated. The industrial stories of American democratic achievement are not exhausted by any single account. Each operation, each weapon system, each logistical miracle reveals another dimension of what this country produced when tested at its fullest. The next account is prepared.